Well, thank you everybody for joining us today for the third of these quarterly presentations. So I think there's a fair amount to go through, and I'll be able to probably catch some of the questions along the way. So do feel free to put something in the chat, but I'll leave some time at the end, and I'm available after it to chat as long as we want to. So again, today is the kind of the Q2 presentation. And I want to go through a couple of things that I hope will kind of add to the thinking, whether you're a startup, contractor, or innovation team, and so on. Folks that are all involved in this industry we love so much. So in the past 6 months, we've gone through a number of things that I'm going to review again, very high level, but not everybody saw some of that. And it kind of sets up some points that we'll be making a little bit later. I'm going to focus a little bit on IT as an area. There's some other data in here and there, and talk a little bit about productivity versus quality and other things that you can do. So I like to structure this as demand, supply, and then some ideas. So there's an idea that on the supply side, and by that I mean the companies producing and selling construction technologies, primarily software, that we're getting to a place where there's a qualitative change in how much data is available. And I think that we're in a place now where that actually matters, and it changes what that data can do for you. And I want to dive into what that means. And it's really about asking questions and making some suppositions, but we'll see where that all leads. And the final point is, we hear about industry analysis a lot. I want to go through what is probably the most powerful, if people have been at it a little while, way to do that, and that's a 5 forces analysis. I think that for a lot of companies starting out, a lot of companies trying to kind of enter a market, we get a little too narrowly focused on folks that look a lot like us when there's maybe more than that going on. So again, stop me along the way. The final piece, I have to say, this time around, I was lucky enough to get some data from actual people that have companies that have produced enough data that they can add to it. So I want to thank all of them in general now, and I'll get specific at the end. So it's kind of exciting that we're in a place now where we can make some statements and some learnings that can be shared based on platforms that are in the market now, and we'll see more about that a little bit later. So I always start with what's the demand for tech, and that's another way of saying what's the industry that we're selling into, and how can we look at that and understand it in ways that are more nuanced and more useful than we've got 1.3 trillion and 7 or 8 million people and so on and so forth. So you guys some of you have seen in the past, I've kind of taken a segmented approach where how do we break that down? And along the way, I also got into the first thing I guess I'm going to talk about, which is labor. Everybody knows about the labor shortage. Last time around, I kind of got specific about saying, look, this is structural, it's not cyclical. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be spending time and effort going after recruitment and so on. And in fact, I'm looking at doing some pretty fun things along those lines. But the reality is, recent pandemic aside, you could see those weird spikes that are kind of anti-spikes at the end. The labor shortage has been going up for 20 years. Obviously, the underlying economics make it bounce around, but the trend line is that it's going up, and the percentage of the population that's working is also going down. And that has to do with the underlying demographics, not having to do with any policies or education or any of that. We as a society, like most of the developed world, are aging. So as we think about the labor shortage, it's important not to hope that it's going to get better in a couple of years, because 20 years ago we had 200,000 too few people. You know what I mean? And then we had a pretty bad dive in the housing market, which meant that there were fewer openings, and that took a while to recover. But we're back on that trend line again. So I think that it's important not to think about
bottling up rate.
Say again? Okay. So it's important to think about this as a structural change, not something that's going to kind of come back around. So I kind of got to this a minute ago. It's important not to think that we're in a $1.3 trillion market, and most people that are really in this don't. Here's one way to cut them that I presented last year. This is all census data, by the way, census and BLS data. The specific numbers change, but the proportions don't, and the fact that there are vastly different things being done is what is the point of kind of this slide, and the point I'm generally making, that the go-to-market is increasingly, well, first of all, it was always very different. You're not going to sell to a company with 1,000 people the same way you're selling to, a pipe fitter who's got a truck and an LLC. And in the middle, it's obviously different. And in a moment, we're going to dive into what those look like a little bit more, with the goal of saying, look, as you're thinking about how to develop a product, how to deliver a product, how to sell or go to market, it's really critical that we think clearly about this and stop telling people that you're competing in a $1 trillion market, because really nobody is, except, as I say, except maybe Excel. A lot of you have seen this one before, so kind of different go-to-market. It's sort of the same idea, but looked at it a little bit differently. So looking at those same segments, so along the bottom, you can see that those are the same numbers. You can also see that it's interesting that even though there's 1,000+ people in some of these large companies, if you're looking at selling to things that are about personal productivity or about the worker per se, you're going to find that actually some of the mid-sized companies have more actual people to talk about. So if you're looking at businesses, obviously it skews very much to the left as for smaller companies. But when you're looking at actual numbers of people, you're going to find that the middle of the range is often a bigger pond to fish in, so to speak. Now, I have to warn you that some of this is a little wonky because the buckets aren't the same size, and I totally appreciate that. Nevertheless, these are the buckets we have. So if we're going to look at them, we can use them as a tool to think about where, as a business, or where, when I think of competition, in the case of a contractor, what is going on in these different areas and these different segments. So here's just another look at it. And I thought this one was interesting too, when you look at again, this is 2019 census data. They do an economic census that isn't quite at the decade level. And when you look at the number of people by the amount of payroll per segment, you start to see that it's interesting how the pay changes across the different firm size. Now, I want to be clear, this is all of construction. In a minute, I'm going to look at a sub-segment of it, and then later quarterlies, we're probably going to dive in and chop this up a little bit more. But the idea that compensation varies quite that much across different segments, I thought was really interesting. With sort of the mid-tier right under the top 200 companies being the highest level. I might assume that that's because of what they're doing, but I don't have data to back that up. So there's a reason for it. Again, it's not provided the way this data gets provided. So I also wanted to take a look and start to really get into specialty contractors. So this is how many of them there are. We looked before, we saw numbers that were, about double this. So you're looking at, not surprisingly, dramatically more small contractors, because everybody kind of thinks that, right? Well, here's an example of what we're looking at. And again, by the way, at the end of this physical presentation, which I'm going to put up on SlideShare, I actually have the link to the census page where anybody that's interested in digging into this can go further. I've had a couple people ask me where the numbers came from. So this time I'm providing that pretty explicitly. I thought this was interesting too. So you see that same pattern about the size of the size of the firm and the relative level. The numbers are a little lower than they were generally, which I found interesting. I can't go too much deeper in terms of implications, but now we know a little bit more about the industry than we did before. The final piece in kind of reviewing, and that data I just showed you, I hadn't shown you before. This is one more piece that I did do last time. There isn't, that I've seen, a great source of data for the size of market. You see people, again, you see the 1.3 trillion, you see the this, the that, the 400 billion. The reality is nobody producing software is playing in a market that size. So I refer you to last quarter's workup where I got to these numbers. It's just kind of a reminder to say that, you're looking at probably over the next little while, something like a $25 to $35 billion market. I'm wide open to someone relooking at assumptions. Again, this is back of the envelope, making some assumptions about how many people are in the industry and some of the other things that led up to this. But again, thinking about what's our TAM and thinking about it in a way that isn't, kind of really big and really not realistic. Like you're not competing as a software company with a mechanical contractor or with a general contractor. All those people will take much bigger pieces of the pie than a service provider and a software provider will. And this is true across all industries. It's really important to understand what can you really go after, as opposed to what overall market are you playing in. And again, on SlideShare, this entire workup is available for people to refer to. So the whole point of that was to start to really give people some ideas and some kind of starting points when we think about what we're playing with and what the market that we're really working in looks like. Start to really dig in so that we can be useful. An example of that is there's a company called Red Team, and they explicitly go after the 20,000 or so companies that are just below the ENR 400. That's fantastic. That is them saying it's very populated at the top end. Everybody knows how to find the ENR 400 because it's like the Billboard 100. So they go and they're quite explicit about it. I'm not telling anyone any secrets here, but that's an example, I think, of a company that's thinking clearly about the market they're playing in and strategically going after an area that is less contested. There's still plenty of people playing there. It just gets a lot less press. So as we've just talked, or I've just talked a little bit about how many people are there in different parts, how many companies are there. As we think about the technology landscape that we are a part of, there's a new dynamic that I think is interesting. By the way, this is the last time we're going to have an animated slide. I just couldn't help myself. So the idea here is that everyone has an IT department or their email wouldn't work. But as more and more software gets onboarded and as innovation teams grow and specialize and really get some experience under their belt, and ops teams use more and more software, you're starting to find that sophisticated IT departments, and again, that's not a knock on anyone now, it's thinking about a tactical versus strategic role. And I think that this has happened across the industry over the last 20, 30 years. When I say all industries. And in construction, I think we're starting to see this more and more. I literally today had a conversation with a general contractor whose IT team came and said, we'd like to consume your API directly, which means, it says a lot about the sophistication and how many, internal developers and so on. So I think you're going to start to see some of the complaints about data connectivity and being able to hook things together. It's not that they'll recede, but IT teams will be able to handle this like they do in manufacturing and services and banking and so on. So I've kind of presaged this a bit. Larger firms are establishing strategic IT departments. I'll get into what I mean by that a little bit in a minute. And I think they're leading to a very different sales process. And that's the reason why I wanted to bring it up here is, I have personally sold enterprise software into pharmaceuticals and some other folks that have a pretty robust IT team, and it's like the second meeting, and it is like an eye exam. It is 90 minutes of asking you about your stack and this and that, and I think you see a little less of that in construction. It does happen, but I think you're going to see that more and more, and we'll get into cybersecurity and why I think that will be true. But often, what I'm at least seeing is it's not quite as top down. Again, if you have a ransomware attack, it probably starts to be top down. But I think it's evolving through innovation teams, through operation teams, and so on, as they start to need more and need the same thing over and over again. The critical point here is, again, thinking, talking to startups and folks that are providers into this community and this market. I'm telling you that it's coming, that the sale is going to start to become more of a technical one, more of a cybersecurity one. You'll be talking about your stack a lot differently than you might be right now. And I think that as these consolidate under their CIOs, they'll be at the table. That's the kind of thing you often hear that phrase is, do they have a place at the table where strategic decisions are made? And again, not to in any way imply that doesn't happen now, but I think that the role is going to continue to be more sophisticated as IT goes from being a support role to make sure that all the everything works, to an actual agent of change and an agent of business model kind of, reworking. So what are the drivers of change? Competition is one. And by that, I mean, it's one thing to get a sophisticated piece of software. It's quite another to make the most of it. And that's where, you're buying this software, you're implementing it, having a team whose job it is to make sure it's always up, but also really organize the day-to-day running of it is really important. And there are innovation teams that do that, but often that's not what they're there for. They're there for the front end to pull things in and so on. Cybersecurity is absolutely going to be, more and more of a thing. Owner requirements. Owners are going. You are already seeing owners require more and more integration with their general contracting teams. And a final point is the reality is a lot of times it's just internal operational frustrations. And frankly, that's what you hear the most of right now is I hear people talking about how pieces don't connect. And that is very often solved either as with outside consultants, which often isn't viewed as sustainable, or it's an internal IT team that's solving it. So Infotech is a firm that does some of what Gartner does. Forgive me for the fact this is a bit of an eye chart. The net here is they went out and did a fair amount of research amongst construction companies and found that construction IT is effective in vendor management and service desk functions. So again, at the time of this, which is about a year and change ago, the belief was that right now IT teams are at their strongest when they're managing vendor management and service desk functions. So supporting my point that there is a way to go to kind of more strategically support the business and knit things together into networks as opposed to one-off, kind of siloed software. And you hear this a lot, is that modern IT departments are strategic enablers of the business. And this, I mean, in the general sense, again, when you talk to a bank or you talk to a manufacturer or you talk to, you name it, very often, certainly when IP is a big deal, like in pharmaceuticals, but the idea that it isn't just another way to keep the lights on, it's about how can we do things that we couldn't do before with all of this technology that we've learned to use. The idea, and this is kind of a map, and again, it's an eye chart, but you get the idea that you're talking about strategy and governance. Governance is an interesting term that often turns people off, but at net, it means understanding where all your files are and how they're being, how you're gating who can touch them and control them and so on and so forth. Governance is enormously important for a number of reasons, security being one of them, but also just good operations, people, resources, infrastructure, security and risk. And then the fact that apps, sometimes you want to make your own app. Sometimes you don't want to have to pull one from a vendor. And creating your own apps that often are just an automation or many of you will have heard of robotic process automation, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later. That sort of thing very often needs an internal team to really make work because it doesn't work that well out of the box. You need to noodle it. And that's a big point here, is that teams that can understand how to make the varying levels of complete software solutions work for you is increasingly important. So this is the general point that I'm kind of getting at here, is going from a functional IT department, which can be, an amazing group of people, but their focus is a little more on vendor management, on email, on file management, on baseline application management and security, to strategic IT departments where the role of the CIO is considered, really critical. And sometimes you'll have a contractor that has a CTO. And for those of you who aren't quite as clear on that as someone who lives with this all day long, CIO generally is meant to be managing internal systems, and a CTO is generally meant to be managing and developing external systems, which is why you often have startups with a CTO and not a CIO, and contractors with a CIO and not a CTO. But the fact that you're finding more and more contractors who think in such a way that they're going to produce software that sometimes they will sell outside of the organization is really exciting. And that it isn't a new thing, right? I mentioned Red Team earlier. They came out of a contractor. M Suite came out of a contractor. And honestly, they're more than that. I'm just not thinking of them right now. And the idea there is you're getting at company-wide integrations. You're getting at rigid standards for security. You're getting at in-house development of software and of applications, enterprise data bus management. And that's an interesting idea. Some of you may have heard of integrated platform as a service. Well, the equivalent of that inside a company is an enterprise data bus, which again is what I was talking to someone about earlier today, and it absolutely made my day, I got to tell you. But also sophisticated cybersecurity. So we talked about standards a second ago, but the reality of cybersecurity is it takes an effort, not just the tech, something we'll get into in a second. So again, why does all this matter? The purchase process, I think you're going to see continue to change. And it will become more and more of looking into your stack and looking into what you're doing. It will be challenging, especially for early stage companies who are often breathlessly getting an MVP out the door and hoping it all goes well. I think that you're going to find that you're going to need to know your stack a lot more clearly than might have been true in the past. And more importantly, the people in front of the client are going to have to know that. Data privacy requirements are going to change, as will cybersecurity requirements change. I think you're just going to see more and more requirements that are not that crazy, and there's plenty of documentation out there and training and so on that can help companies to do this. The point of my telling you this is that you should expect that this will be true. And for those of you looking at companies and advising smaller companies, I am raising the flag that this is something that they should know about. And now, obviously, they need to first get a product that works, and they need to make sure they've got lots of other ducks in rows. But this has got to be on the list, just like it is on every board of every public company. Their cybersecurity is now a major concern. Well, in a smaller version of that, advisors, investors, and board members of startups and smaller companies also need to be thinking about this, both for their own good, but also if you become a vector for a cybersecurity attack, it is not going to do wonders for your reputation or relationship with your client. And a point I want to make right there is a couple of years ago, the FBI actually was making the rounds of mid-sized companies and talked about how it is mid-sized companies that often are the threat vector, as opposed to larger companies who are often really, really locked down. Let me just check something. Okay, I just heard that I'm losing my audio. I'm not sure why that's true. I'll try to speak up. So where I was going with that, excuse me, is the FBI made a point of going around and telling companies like the ones that I'm talking about, smaller companies that, 10, 15, 30, 50 people, are often the way that you get into bigger companies. So it's important that vendors and startups and companies that are going into big contractors think like that, think that they could be a threat vector, and they're going to want to be able to reassure people that they won't. So what do you do about that? An MVP implies technical shallowness. It implies in your narrow area of value, you've got it really solved, but other places maybe less so. But it doesn't have to be. So I have often had to do this where you document your stack. What are you built on top of? Make sure each layer is secure. This is not a long process. This is an afternoon. This is maybe a day or two. Try to avoid open source. A great example of that is I was selling virtual reality into pharma and found that Steam VR was open source and people had a problem with that. So we actually had to do all sorts of, go through all sorts of hoops to make sure that that wasn't an issue. And the final one is kind of the easiest and hardest, and that's implement internal protocols for passwords and do some cybersecurity training. This is actually what most cybersecurity certifications like FedRAMP and SOC 2 look for is it's about people. It's not really not only about the technology. It's not only about whether you've got antivirus or something like that. Are people being trained not to click on phishing? Are there phishing attempts? Are they being trained not to use an 8-digit password instead of using a 12-digit password, which is so much more secure? So simple things that a startup can do so that when they're speaking to their clients, they can represent that, yes, we take this seriously. And for our size, we've done the best that we can. So I mentioned at the beginning that I was lucky enough to have a number of folks help me out with some of their data. And when I wanted to look at cybersecurity specific to construction, I couldn't find better data out there, and happened to be talking to Ronan Vengosh of Ignite, who, by the way, today we did I launched the podcast, so you can hear from him in addition to seeing some of the data that they've provided. They've got about 3,000 construction companies around the world, and they've got, I don't know how many they have, how many companies in total, but it's multiple of that. So we were able to look at a large, it isn't representative. It is big enough that I think it's valid and it's directionally useful. And we looked at a couple of things. Actually, they were kind enough to actually dig in with their internal teams to kind of run some numbers. The headline is that they found that construction companies are twice as likely to have ransomware attacks than everybody else in their database, than the average of their database. I found that really interesting. And you can't go ask why would that be true, because people that do ransomware don't answer surveys. That said, you can assume a few things. One of them is that construction companies have folks coming in and out. The second one is that it is an amazingly vulnerable industry, because you don't want to build anything if somebody freezes up all of your drawings. God forbid you have to redo something. I mean, rework is like the worst thing ever. So it unlike a lot of other kinds of company, a construction company is going to freeze when somebody grabs their certain data. So I think it's more likely to say yes, I'll pay, and also again more likely to really feel the pain. Another interesting fact that came out of this is they did an analysis of the size, and they found that about 45%, 44% of attacks were big companies, about 44% were small companies, and only about 10% were mid-tier companies. Really interesting. Again, we can't survey why that would be true. Some hypothesis that I think makes a little sense is large companies have a lot of people. They have brands that people know, and they're easier to find. That's probably a lot of it. And in smaller companies, again, it's probably because they're a little bit less sophisticated, a little less bandwidth to have anyone in IT who can keep an eye on things. So they're a little bit more vulnerable, and potentially companies that are 50 to 500 million are more likely to kind of be in a sweet spot. But irrespective of why, it's interesting to see this. And here's another one that came out of this, and I think this is probably true beyond just construction, but we got real numbers here, is that repeat attacks are very likely. So people get hit more than once. Probably because, again, you're on someone's radar and they've presumably found one way in, up to 6 times in 6 months. That's astounding. So you're getting nailed over and over again, which means it really makes sense to train and do everything you can. This is a little more on the contractor side, but it's honestly true everywhere. Do everything you can to avoid this ever happening, because once you're on radar, who knows, you get passed around, your data gets sent around the dark web. Honestly, I don't know the mechanics of it, except we unequivocally know that this happens, that once you get hit, you're probably going to get hit again, which is, no good. So I talked about this a second ago. Cybersecurity isn't only about IT, and this now is true for everybody that's involved in the industry. It's more about people. I mean, obviously there is a technical component, and I don't mean that, but typically you'll hear someone say, once they've gone and locked down and done some pretty basic things that often your cloud provider can do a lot of for you, the big weakness is people that just aren't paying attention. They'll do crazy things like pick up a USB stick and put it into their computer, and God knows what's in it. They'll get an email, they'll get a text from someone saying, hey, can you send me that money to this? I mean, there are all sorts of crazy stuff. It's people thinking that if you see somebody's name on the email, it must be from them, because they don't look at the actual email address, which could be, anything. I get that. You still get that. Spam is way better than spam control is way better than it was, but it is not what we all want it to be. So to summarize that main point is strategic IT is critical, and you're going to see more and more of it. Contractors are going to need to up their game to compete. It's going to be an area where people do better than each other because they're maximizing the way they use the data and the technology that produces that data. Software and tech providers are going to need to up their game to win business. I think you're going to be seeing this more and more over the coming years as people ask, okay, if we include you and we really roll you out, I need to know that you don't have a team that has lax standards internally, or you're on a bad platform, or you're using some input I don't understand. Like a lot of things, and the reason why I often start with segments is you should expect this to be segment driven for the obvious reason that bigger companies have more overhead and staff to support this sort of thing. So larger companies will lead, but ransomware and cybersecurity matter for everyone. So no matter what size you are, I encourage you to get smart about this. There's a lot of resources out there, whether it's, go to Coursera and you can take a course on it. Any one of the cloud providers have very good, everything from certification to free training, just to make you conversant with what things are so that you have a sense of the risks. So that is sort of the first bit, the demand piece, where I kind of go through the best we can, well, the best I can do anyway, in terms of providing some inputs and ideas for what we're selling into. I've seen some comments, guys. I'm on a little bit of a roll. Let me get through this, and we can kind of discuss some of some of the comments. So I see something pretty interesting happening now, and I want to ground the conversation in a question, and that is really, what is technology for? I find myself quoting the Simon Sinek "Start with Why" a lot, and this is one of those. Are we doing this because of productivity growth? Are we doing it because we want to cut costs? Are we doing it to improve quality? Are we doing it to accomplish entirely new things? You can probably guess that I'm going towards the latter half of that list. I want to spend a minute on productivity, though. This is not a new problem. Ever since economists thought of the term productivity, people have been hemming and hawing about it, either marveling at how some other country is doing, or rarely do we say, oh my gosh, we're having a good year. Usually we're either lamenting the fact that we're not as productive as we were, or the fact that someone else seems to be more productive. The key thing to note here is construction has can benefit hugely from the fact that other industries often have gone through related processes, in that they've really implemented software and IT at deep levels like we're in the middle of now. The mid-90s, you saw, after a decade of IT, that's mid-80s, excuse me, that seemed like a long time ago, but people were buying, hardware, they were buying all sorts of mainframes and so on and so forth, and really going from paper to digital. If that sounds familiar, I'm telling you, it's happened before. And the point is, they looked at productivity as measured by economic output divided by number of people doing it, which is the best way to do it when you've got a whole economy to look at. Nevertheless, it hides an awful lot. And for 10, 15 years, nobody saw the productivity improving. Now, the reality is that was the 70s into the 80s, when there were some really big macro things going on that probably had an impact. Nevertheless, they finally started to see it in the 90s, because it got down into people doing new things with it, not just cutting costs out, a point I'll get to in a second. But the thing I'll say real quick is classic productivity measurement. Anyone who is in construction, I hear this over and over again, a construction version of this argument, which is what gets delivered is higher value for less money. So you're not getting credit for the fact, in taking a construction example, that you have more inspections than you used to, or that you have higher safety standards and more safety protocols. Things are more difficult to deliver. Environmental regulations are all costs that don't show up in productivity. The same was true in the general economy, where things like, look at an iPhone compared to its equivalent, 10, 15 years, or maybe 20 years ago. There is no equivalent. So it's really, really hard to take productivity seriously. I mean, you don't really have an option but look at it, but you need to be careful about getting too wound up. That said, everybody who's running a crew or running a company is, of course, worried about productivity. But the last point I want to make here is across industries, we find that too much of a focus on technology often distracts from the fact that if you want micro improvements, as in your team, your company, your unit, you're going to find that job engagement is way more important than the technology. The technology does other things, but looking for it and hoping that your ROI is going to be increased productivity is a really hard argument to make, and an even harder one to prove, because it's hard to tease out how the technology does or doesn't do that. In contrast, across industries, we find that there is a correlation between productivity and job engagement as measured from surveys. So if there's a focus, it might be there. And honestly, innovation teams often can do a lot there when it comes to some events and engagement and so on. And the other one is manpower deployment, which is legit, is that it's often, especially on kind of job sites, you'll have people that are too many on this job and not enough on that. And I think you're seeing a lot of that happen now. So my point here is stop focusing only on productivity. I think there are a lot of people are tired of this. McKinsey article, God bless them, they did a lot of good, but it was 4 years ago, we get it. I think that there are other places that we can spend our time thinking, and I want to go there next. Forgive me for this. I'm going to skip through this, but it'll be in the doc that you can look at later. But this is from somebody who spends all his time integrating new technology and new software into companies. And his point is, once you get used to software, once you get used to automating processes, whether it's RPA, AI, or just plain software, you're not going back. IT changes the way you do business. And that's the point that I'm trying to make today is, we've kind of gone on a little journey talking about how IT is becoming more strategic. Well, this is what that means. Strategic means changing the way you do business because you're doing things not just faster and better, you're doing things that weren't even possible before. And I'm going to get into some examples and some illustrations of that a little bit in a minute. But if you can take, this is a mortgage example, but you see the same thing elsewhere. If you can do something in 5 minutes that took a week or took a day, think about all the Revit automation tools that are out there, like Evolve MEP and blanking on some other ones, but there's some other great ones out there. That Collectus is one that I've worked with as well, that automates some of the detailing. Something that literally took a day to do, you can now do with a couple of clicks of a button. You can now iterate and you can now think in a way that is way more flexible and productive than would have been true before. Really hard to measure that though, because at the end of the day, you're still giving somebody a BIM model. It's just a better BIM model than it might have been. And more importantly, you've gone back and forth and you've got the opportunity to work with it more. The key thing here is we haven't gotten to you have changed the business model, but that's what happens. We're not there yet, but I am predicting that we're going to see that. You're going to see contractors that have the unique ability to pull enormous amounts of data together and do things with it in a way that a vendor will also be able to do from another angle. But I think you're going to find data-driven business models that will, I'll have some ideas in just a sec. The key thing here is it becomes a differentiator for you. In an industry where everyone is struggling to be the person to pick and to limit the number of people that are considered a competitor, this is one great way to do it. And that's where IT can be strategic. So how do you change the business model? How do you differentiate? Are you competing for labor, competing for jobs, competing for improving profitability? Definitely some initial ideas. Before I dive any deeper though, I want to talk a little bit about what people have done. So how have they differentiated? How have they used this? Deloitte has done a number of, and actually they have a yearly study on AI. And I'm using AI because there's better data on it than there is general software. People kind of take that one as a given, but this for me is an example of what people do. Everyone thought that AI was going to take over the jobs and we'd all be fired and it was coming for white collar and so on and so forth. The reality is that's not what happened. This is a survey from senior leadership across the economy. Companies went to enhance their products and services. They optimize internal business operations, make better decisions, automate tasks, and so on. The very bottom is reducing headcount through automation, which is I think really interesting. Still a quarter, so it's not nothing, but it is hardly the harbinger of doom that everybody thought it would be not so many years ago. And this was, by the way, in the height of the hype in 2018, 2017, when everyone thought we were going to have level 5, autonomous vehicles and all sorts of stuff, people were saying the same thing. So this isn't just because, we don't have cars, autonomous vehicles, and everyone's a little deflated. This is this idea and this pattern of spending money on the top line, not the bottom line, and using software and the automation and the capabilities that come with it to make your business better is a stable pattern I've seen over a number of years. You see the same basic data, but mapped a little bit differently. Efficiency means doing more, not using less. Again, you can see the upper right is making processes more efficient, enhancing products, improving decision-making. And you're going to see, honestly, I think the first place that construction companies are really seeing benefits is honestly in probably improving decision-making, just visibility into what's going on at a much more granular level than was true before. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And at the bottom left, kind of the worst corner to be in is reducing headcount. So really it's important not just to say that nobody's going to get fired because of a robot. I'm not sure that that's true. The point is people are using software, using technology to do new things, not just to tighten up and save money. So the question is, how do you do that? How do you think about all of the things that software can provide and the data that it provides? How can you do that when the technology provides orders of magnitude better data? And I'm going to give you some concrete examples of what I mean by orders of magnitude. This is exactly a segue if it feels like one, it is. An example of a technology that has really come a long, long way, and it feels like it's had a really good quarter, is machine vision on the job site. So I've spoken to a number of companies, all of you probably have, whether it's Versatile, Open Space, Struction Site, Construe, and a number of others that are using computer vision in varying degrees to do increasingly sophisticated things on the job site. Because I happen to know them and happen to ask some of these folks, I asked them for some top line data of what their products can do. And what you're finding, and I'm going to get into the specifics in a minute, but I'm going to ask you, if you had vast quantities of data behave differently, when you have orders of magnitude more, you have a level of certainty, I don't know about 100%, but let's call it 99, at all times about job progress. What if you knew? Because every 15 minutes or every hour, a system is updating and assessing where the job is. What if you could predict exactly when you need materials, down to the hour, down to probably not 15 minutes, but much more accurately than now? What if you could schedule work perfectly? Now, again, it's an aspiration, but the question is, what if you could do it way better than you can now? What if you could take the billions of points of job progress data and analyze it for the next job? People do that now, but it isn't billions of points of data. It's, daily reports and it's reflection and it's some data points. But again, you're talking about going from, digitized paper data, which is where a lot of people are, to a big step change, and saying, we now know down to the 15-minute or the half-hour increment what was going on in our job site. And actually, some of these products are every 5 seconds, which is almost video. What would you do if you could correlate that with whatever you care about, whether it's profitability, safety, punch list, closeout? So the question that I'm not fully answering here, I'm going to illustrate it and have some ideas. But the next stage is, what do you do with all this data? So Versatile's Crane View, they didn't give me all of this. Some of this, especially the left-hand side, is me kind of just trying to make a counterpoint. But this idea of sparser job site information, the kind of status quo now, is, you get operator logs, you get basic machine telemetry for a crane, of course. As background, Versatile provides a device that sits on a crane's kind of hook. As you can tell, I'm not a salesman, but it provides down-looking cameras and all sorts of information about the crane itself. The key thing is, you're talking about on the left, qualitative, written, spoken, few times a day reports. Possibly some telemetry from the machine itself, very often not. In contrast, high density job site data, you've got live image every 5 seconds. That's 9,600 in an 8-hour shift. That's insane. Again, that's like, 2 orders of magnitude more than you, or maybe even 3 orders of magnitude more than you're going to get kind of with the status quo. They get dynamic weight from the load, so they know how much is being pulled accurately. Exact XYZ, in other words, where it sits in space as the crane is going up, down, and so on, in a way that is way more accurate than is, it's 10 feet up or it's 5 feet up. It's 10.4 feet and it went up to, 15.3 feet, and how many times and so on. So you now have quantitative, machine-generated, continuous high-frequency data. It is just a different beast. It's like saying, water isn't water at 210 degrees or 100 degrees Celsius. It becomes something different. And this is what I'm arguing here, is that more becomes different after a certain point. And I think we are there with job site data. We're certainly getting there. Struction site, same story, different part of a different way of doing things. They're kind of replacing daily logs and the photos that get taken, but you estimate maybe 3,000 photos get taken on a job. They're not really mapped to the exact work location. It's kind of that part of the building or whatever. Often kind of in an iPad folder in a folder or an iPad or something like that on your phone. Again, kind of qualitative, written a few times a day, not so organized, not so easy to run analysis against. And that's the other thing that's even true about Versatile, of course, is all this data now is, A, there's a ton of it. B, it's, where it is, it's in the cloud, and tagged. As a result, you can run analysis for the next 10 years if you want. So construction site tells me it's not crazy for a job to have 300,000 images. So again, it's 100x what you would reasonably expect if someone was just snapping photos and that Super and other people were taking pictures and kind of uploading them into, Google Drive or something. Auto tagged with the exact location, so you can run analysis on them in a way that is just not feasible in kind of normal operations. Again, I mentioned cloud-based for analysis, but also tied to machine vision, so you can do other things with it. And that's really important. You're able to, once this is connected to an AI system that you have or are in the process of training, now you can do things. And you're hearing this from OpenSpace, you're hearing this from Struction Site, Construe, and some others, where they're actually able to use video and images to assess how finished a particular job, part of a job site is. I can't vet how accurate that is, except I know that they've done a lot of great work, and it seems to be very well received by people that have used it. Again, you now have a kind of almost a meta data point, which is, at what point, what percent completion against people that were there and all sorts of other amazing stuff. So again, the difference between sparse job site information and high density job site data. You can make the argument, and I will, that we went from paper to digitized paper, which is kind of the sparse job site information, now to the next level, which is this high density job site data. A final one is this is me kind of making a summary here, kind of a fundamental shift. So sparse job site information to high density. Going from daily observations, it's mostly in the super's head, pictures loosely referenced, now to hourly continuous, tens of thousands of data points a day. Really, really a different place to be. And it's not just machine vision. So I grabbed some data from Smart Barrel, and they're actually an automatic check-in for workers. As a result, their data is very, very good. And it's just, there's a ton of data that comes along with it. And this is just a quick example, is, you're able to quantitatively see how different days perform. Honestly, too much of this data is proprietary, so we couldn't go too much deeper, but the companies themselves are able to go way deeper than this and look by shift and look by time of day and all sorts of different things to get at people coming on and off a job site. Really, really exciting stuff. You're going to see this though with everything. So machines will do this, whether it's backhoes or whether it's, drills and so on and so forth. The density of data that we are expecting to see is just exploding. And now the question is, what do you do? What do you do with all that data? And I'm arguing that is the next wave of innovation I think we're going to see. And what's cool about this is typically this sort of thing takes a minute. It's like entirely new technology. You're going to find that innovation teams and operations teams and vendors and analytics vendors and so on and so on, it's going to be worked out and processed, I think, over the next couple of years. But I think we're going to see, because of driven by all of this data, and new level of operations and truly new things coming. Things like, what do you do with this? Selling data, imagine a contractor that sells data products back to owners, right? Or briefing architects in design build projects. I mean, this data, marry that to new kind of project delivery methods, and where there's a much more collaborative way of working. And you can imagine an amazing way of working together based on data, especially when you're iterating and doing multiple projects together. And at the end, better, safer, and faster projects. And the final point that I haven't seen yet, but I think we will, is new business models. And some of what I just talked about constitute new business models. So folks, there's a couple more things I want to get through, and then we'll open for Q&A. So apologies, I got a little excited this time. So a lot of you will know Nathan Wood and the Construction Progress Coalition, and how they have a monthly meeting where there are roundtables. And in one of those roundtables, Josh Levy and Josh was actually moderating it. It was about the risks of scanning. So what came out of that was a realization that lots of people in the field are nervous about sharing scans, primarily was what we were talking about, but also models and images. So Josh and I went and actually did some research and produced a paper. I can't go through all the details here, but I encourage you to go check it out because it's kind of short, but more importantly, a lawyer produced it. So it's pretty valid and pretty cool. We published early last week, I think it was Thursday, a quick podcast with Josh and I talking about it. So really excited about this. I'm going to do more things like this. So wide open, if people have questions or areas you'd like some research done that you think are helpful for the community. That's what this is about, is giving contractors, especially smaller contractors that may or may not have, the ability to ask a lawyer. And honestly, the reality is, in the middle of a job, you don't call the lawyer anyway. We found some key outcomes that relate to how individuals can behave, but also if you're a contractor, as you're setting up the contract itself, and you know that your team wants to work a certain way, it's important to go and make sure that you have the right language in there. Now, obviously, a guy that has software that works on contracts, you might think would obviously be recommending contracts. But actually, we got there by looking at all of the cases that were relevant, and most of them were more about process and more about things like privacy. Generally speaking, the real risk is covered in a contract, and that is you indemnify yourself or you limit the risks of someone using, if you do a scan, it's for reference only, or so on and so forth. And the cool thing is that consensus docs, actually it's called consensus docs form 301. And again, Josh goes into this more in the paper. But the idea that there already is content out there, and I'm pretty sure Contract Docs does it, AIA Contract Docs has language for this as well. The finding here is that if you know that scanning and model sharing and so on will help you in the beginning of a contract, try to make sure that that's covered. So, and again, if you go to constructedfutures.com, you'll find this podcast. It's only 30 minutes. We had a lot of fun doing it. Final piece, this will be quick. I'd love everybody to spend some time thinking about the Porter's 5 forces. It is what drives most of, a fair amount of what McKinsey does and other folks whose job it is to look at industries and understand them. So Porter revolutionized business strategy. It really was kind of, they had all sorts of funny words for it before 1980, and really kind of solidified it as the idea of strategy, and strategy is how do you compete. That every other word for strategy is somebody doing something different. The real word for the real meaning of strategy is meant to be competition. It's meant to be competing against others. And the key thing that he came up with, which I think is hugely interesting in a complex industry like ours, is companies don't compete for sales, you compete for profits. And that's important because it isn't only competitors who can take profit from you, it's also suppliers, it's buyers, and in both cases, that's kind of a negotiation. Substitutes can make it harder for you to argue for the pricing you want. New entrants can do the same, and obviously existing competitors. So all of these can have an impact on your profit as you think about it across your entire value chain, from your inputs to your process to your outputs. So here is what you often see is these 4 arrows pointing in at the kind of competition. This is the kind of pattern that you see a lot. And the idea is the way you think of structure is who has the most relative power. Really important way of thinking about it. So in the case of buyers, are there a lot of buyers and only 1 or 2 of you, in which case you have more relative power than they do because they don't have so many choices? And in contrast, it's the other way around. Are there a lot of buyers and only a few of you, in which case, only a few buyers and a lot of you, in which case they have a lot of choice and you don't. So it's very much driven by supply and demand, which everybody can kind of understand intuitively. And substitutes and entry both change the dynamic of how many of you there are, how many competitors there are. And in so doing, they change kind of that ratio of how many people are selling and how many people are buying. The way you get at that is, I mentioned before, how many of them and choices counterparties have. The other thing, of course, is IP and other protections can also narrow the number of people that your counterparty can choose and how unique your offering is. And at the end of the day, that's what strategy is. Strategy is all about figuring out how to narrow the number of people you reasonably compete with. So I took a crack. This is really, this is how you often do this in a non-quantitative way. The right way to do this is to dig into numbers. But, buyer power is moderate. There's a fair number of buyers. They're often kind of regional, and they need a finite number of people who can do what you do. Supplier power also moderate, depending on where you are and what you mean by supplier. So there may not be that many specialist pipe fitters who know how to do the job, and so on and so forth. Threat of substitutes is pretty low. It's a contractor is going to need to do what a contractor does. You can't have an insurance company do that. Threat of new entry is high because there are often either new contractors, depending on your size, or people entering your regional market. And direct competition, it's just a big industry with lots of people in it. I did the same thing for project management software. And this looks a little bit more dire in that buyer power is moderate because there's just a lot of buyers. Supplier power is pretty low. Getting employees are just normal employees, so there's tons of them. But the threat of substitutes is huge. There's a lot of people that stand up things and enter the market. So kind of both sides of that. There are products that kind of do project management, and there are companies that can stand up something that they can credibly claim can do a good job. Whether that's true or not, it's hard to tell. So entering isn't that expensive. And then the final point is there's already a lot of people there. So as you think about project management software, it's a tough industry. It's a tough segment to enter. It's a good, there's a couple of winners that are doing okay in there. So final point here is, how does this help? A point of differentiation is to reduce choice. Peter Thiel often says competition is for suckers, and this is what he means, is you differentiate so you're not competing, at least you're minimizing it. The point of a value chain is to drive unique value with inputs that aren't themselves that unique by doing things in a unique way. Strategy is creating a business model that makes competition irrelevant. So for startups, I think you're able to answer investors a little more intelligently than a standard XY map of competitors with your company in the upper right. It's not invalid, but you can do better than that, especially when someone is asking you about a moat, which that kind of a chart doesn't help with, but that's exactly what new entrants and substitutes are. For those of you who are interested in this, and I encourage all of you to be interested in this, there's a fantastic writer named Joan Magretta. She's written something recently called, I think, Reading Michael Porter or something like that. Porter himself likes to write 600-700 page books, so I don't think it's worth it, to be honest. Also, you can get some really good, 10-page articles on HBR. So, folks, that is it. I want to go through a quick series of thank yous, and then we'll hopefully have not very much time. Sorry. I don't accept sponsors, but I love data. So if people have data they'd love to see kind of crunched like this for future quarterlies, I'd love to. Thank you to Ignite. Really, really amazing data, really amazing cooperation. I was very appreciative. And then, Versatile, Join was kind enough to send out some invites for me. Document Crunch and Josh were amazing. Instruction Site and Smart Barrel, all really great. And I'd love to continue to do partnerships like this, just to get information out and kind of share some learnings from these amazing platforms that everyone's building. And check out my book and podcast. I don't do this very often, but what the heck. Today, we put out the one with Ronan, who talks about cybersecurity, governance, and some other kind of IT-related things. He's from Ignite. My book you can get on Amazon. Just look for my name. I've so far only written one book. And that's it. Thank you all. This last piece here is just, we've got an amazing community. I do this once a quarter, but the construction dorks are every couple of weeks. Nathan's team does this every month. There's just a lot of great stuff out there. I encourage you to check out. So folks, I will open this to questions. I'm sorry, I just had a lot to get through. Are there any questions while I read what was in there? So I'm going to read what was some of the comments just to kind of finish this out. I won't mention who it is, but well, you can all, oh no, sorry, it was directly. A couple of CEOs of GCs had mentioned to somebody confidentially that between the four of them, they paid around 20 million collectively in ransomware because of cybersecurity attacks. Imagine what that does to anybody's profit. That's an amazing point. Thank you. I think maybe one, nope, that was it. That was the big one. So thank you all for joining. I'll kind of leave the mic open if anybody wants to, ask any questions or comments.
Will you be sharing your presentation?
Yes, so I'm recording this and I'll put it on YouTube, as well as the presentation itself. I'll turn into a PDF that's downloadable on SlideShare. You're all welcome to steal whatever you want. The whole point is hopefully help the conversation.
It's excellent.
Thank you.
Can I just ask you, as you talked about the labor shortage, have you heard of employers or the sector in general talking about how maybe some out of the box rethinking or ways that they're thinking of addressing this? As you said, the bar keeps going up, right?
Yeah, I have not heard good solutions, to be honest. I think that it winds up being a bidding war. It winds up being you take people who aren't quite as good as you hope and kind of make do. So I'm sure people are thinking about it and coming up with solutions, but I have not heard anything good to share, unfortunately.
Thanks, Hugh. That was a really good presentation. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you. So somebody asked, and again, folks, if you want me to mention your name, just do it to everybody. Otherwise, I want to be careful about, sharing. How do I see technology playing a role as the population is aging? Fantastic question. And the point of talking about, and in fact, last quarter, I kind of got into that a little bit more, is I think you're going to see, and this speaks to the question that was just asked, is, how are people going to mitigate this? And I think you're going to find a number of areas where technology helps. Right now, you've got some project management and labor management solutions, like Bridget does a Bridget Bench, I think it is, does they did some really cool stuff. I saw them speak at Society of Construction Solutions about 2 years ago. So I have no idea what they're doing now, but they were able to really dig into how people are being deployed. And I think you're going to find that as an early solution, but also I think you're going to find automation. And I also think that we're not going to have a choice, but have more offsite and prefab. I think that's going to wind up being probably one of the big ways that we address it, is with prefab and offsite. Well, all right, folks. I don't want to have us linger here too long. I'm wide open if anybody, actually, I think I have my email. There we go. So if anyone has any follow-on questions or ideas, I'm keen to do this every quarter. And it really is about, discussing ideas and, kind of pulling out what we can find as quantitative as I can find it, to help us to understand the industry and where it's going and ask good questions. So I'm wide open to thoughts and ideas for the next one in September. My email is here. It's just my name, HughSeaton@gmail.com. I have a not terribly well-designed website where I just stuck a bunch of stuff where you can see the podcast, you can, find the book and so on. So thank you all for joining. I'm really honored you'd spend some of your Thursday with me, and thanks a lot.